Okay, so welcome everyone back to the Crosse Thinkers Podcast. Today we have Donleigh Gaunky joining us to talk about the issues of veteran suicide. And fun fact, Donleigh is actually the first guest who is not a university professor, which I plan to do for a long time, but you're the first one. Okay, so before we start, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm actually a December 2015 graduate from the University of La Crosse. Kind of nice to be able to do this with my own alma mater in some respects, with a bachelor's in science of political science, minor in economics. That was a 7.5-year journey. I started off at the technical college on the other side of the city, and that was after 7 years of serving in the Army. My actual starting date in the Army was in the summer of 2001. Completion date was 13 September 2001. So wow. You can pretty much understand that, I know what I'm going to do for the rest of my career. So did 2 tours to Iraq, one the invasion in 2003, and then another one in late 2005 through 2006. So this issue for me is in many respects personal for a lot of different reasons. One of them being within the first year of being out, I actually had my only suicide attempt, so most you can say, which people will argue how serious it was. It was very much, thankfully, unsuccessful. But there's other aspects to this that don't necessarily show on. I've had what's called ideation episodes, just bad thoughts and these kind of things for years, on and off. So I understand this issue not just from the political side of things, such as it's been getting heated on, but from a personal standpoint. So
I see. So when you talk with your buddies back in the service, how big of a percentage people will have those kind of similar feelings as you do, and maybe attempted suicide?
See, that I don't know per se, because it's hard to know in anybody at a given time. You can't really know somebody unless you have even people you're really close to. Interestingly enough, the people that you tend to be close to sometimes are the people that you miss signs and signals from, or you're willing to kind of wave it off depending on circumstances of the situation. I know of at least 2 people that I served with. I didn't know them particularly real well that have suicide or OD'd on drugs, which I can't tell you whether or not that was a suicide or not for sure in the last 2 or 3 years. So, and these people have been out for a while, but when you're in, I don't know that it's necessarily the primary focus of a lot of people per se, unless their situation is just that bad.
Okay. So when you contacted me, you want to talk about the presentation of this issue in the media, so, and also the complexity of the picture. So
yeah,
how is this thing represented in the media right now?
If you were to look at the difference between the situation as it is versus how it's been presented, the presentation is actually very oversimplified. Very oversimplified. It can actually be condensed down to 18 to 34-year-old post 9/11 veteran suffering from combat-induced post-traumatic stress ends up taking their life. That's how it generally tends to be portrayed in some fact form. I went through a couple of years back in the process of writing a self-published book. I went through EBSCOhost, which is an academic medium, because I could have just gone ahead and done a Google search to try and see the different possible news articles out there, but that algorithm is kind of disconcerting. So I go through a more academic resource, and I found that they had 2,000 print media articles. Only about 1,184 actually applied. But if you were to look at them, there's 2 general things that came out. For the stories that weren't necessarily involving demographics, it's more just getting the statistical value out. Depending on how up-to-date people are on this, at the time when some of the stuff was originally coming out, it was 22. Then it's reversed to 20. Since the VA has updated its modeling on how it determines that rate, it's now down to 17. Although if you re-include the military side of things, it's probably still about 20 a day. But when you start bringing in some of the demographics where they actually start talking about these things, the predominant features you find is it has a tendency to focus very much on 18 to 34-year-olds. They constitute about 66% of the the reporting when those demographics are in, or the post 9/11 conflict generation, which generates almost 90% of the media on these things in comparison to the other ones. So this, as I said, the simplistic picture kind of comes in to what we think this is, when the reality of it, from reports going all the way back for almost 8 years now, demonstrates something entirely different. But you wouldn't know that if you were to just go off of media reporting, mostly paper. And I can't fault them, because papers have been falling on hard times, so they can't necessarily have the capacity to review these things in mass. So they kind of have to go off of judgments where everybody kind of aligns. For like the bigger papers, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, these kind of things. And those have been pretty on message with regards to that presentation that I've demonstrated. The complexity for this thing is just considerably different from what's the portrayal is. Okay. Interestingly, for that same media portrayal in terms of radio and television media, it's almost all post 9/11 focus. There's really not anybody else outside of that, except for maybe as a mentor or a mentee, that kind of a position to the younger vets. So that, where people will have a tendency to get more on TV and radio and follow those more so than maybe print media, that's not helping the situation either.
So it's almost like individual storytelling, and it's just a more compelling story to tell.
Well, yeah, they're trying to find a human story, but if the human story leads to things where, say, Congress gets involved, which it tends to when people get frustrated and they bring things up, they're going to respond. But if they're responding based off of those human stories, mostly anecdotal, still important, but mostly anecdotal, instead of what's out there for them to really know and make good, comprehensive, well-thought, focused policy on it, it tends to inhibit the progress of addressing this issue than it does actually move it forward so that, these losses are down.
I see. So I trust you have done a lot of research on yourself.
Very much.
So
very
can
much.
you tell us several pictures which are not mentioned in the media, but you think will add a lot to the picture?
One of them is where the bulk of the losses actually come from. It's not really necessarily the post 9/11 18 to 34-year-olds. The rates would suggest one thing, but if you look at the proportional amount of losses, it's different. The last rate that they had for the 18 to 34-year-old age bracket for veterans in general has a rate of 45 out of 100,000, which is kind of the typical thing that they do when they do an epidemiological rate. So it seems very high in comparison to like the other generational gap, the other age brackets. But if you were to condense it down to, say, what does that proportionally look like out of, at the moment, the 17, you get about 2. So we're putting a lot of focus, 66 if you want to go on the age, 90 if you want to go on the conflict era, on that 2, and bare crumbs to nothing on the other 15. If you include the military aspect onto it, it goes to about 3. So it's still not very much higher when you incorporate that information either. In terms of the combat aspect and the post-traumatic stress, those are not guarantees either. 2018, they kicked out 2 reports. One was in July, and the other one, I believe, was the end of September. The one in July, when it came out, actually had a graphic that I haven't seen reintroduced. I think they're a little cautious on this for a variety of different reasons. But it actually broke down the issue, the losses over a 10-year span, 2005 to 2015, and they did it by what are called eras. Most of them are designated by the major conflict at the time. So you have Vietnam, World War II, Korea, what they refer to as Gulf War I, which is pretty much Desert Storm, Desert Shield, the 90s through the Overwatch, the no-fly zone protection aspects on that, and then you have what's called Gulf War II, which is pretty much post 9/11. But the one category that stands out even more than all of that was a category called peacetime, which means we weren't involved in any kind of in situation where masses of troops and Marines and these things were called to get involved in what we generally recognize as a conflict. In terms of the conflict eras, the era that actually had the most losses during that period was the Vietnam era. They had about 29% of the losses during that period. But they're actually second if you look at the peacetime cohort, so to speak. That had 33% of the losses. Now, obviously, these are not all. They don't add up to 100 because there's going to be crossover because people have a tendency to be involved in multiple eras. But you can reduce the peacetime aspect down to about 20 to 25% exclusive, which means basically removing about, for the losses in that, somewhere between almost 25 and almost 40%, which is a very wide thing for adjusting for crossover, but it's kind of needed. So you're still dealing with somewhere between 1 out of every 4 or 1 out of every 5 veterans that's taking their lives served at a time when they weren't involved, when we as a nation weren't involved in a conflict at all. So the presumption that combat-induced post-traumatic stress is the primary cause of this thing gets undercut severely by that. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be considered as, and I have always considered it as a contributing factor because you have to take that into consideration. There's no way you can't because post-traumatic stress doesn't necessarily need to be combat-induced. A lot of people that understand things like sexual assault, which we talked beforehand, know that you can have that as a consequence of that. So PTSD as a general thing can't be removed as a contributing factor. It just can't be presumed as an absolutist cause. Moreover, the era aspect needs to be understood as well. The reason why they defined it as era is because you had people that may have been serving in that same time, but were not necessarily involved in the conflict for which that period is named over. A great example on that one would be Vietnam. It's probably the best example on that one for use. We had National Guard and Reserve that in the United States was not activated and not sent overseas. They were serving during the Vietnam War era, but they were not technically involved in the war. Additionally, we had people that were stationed over in Europe for very specific purposes of it was still the Cold War and the concern of the Russians coming over and the wall and that stuff. But they were away from the major conflict from which that whole era is defined. So those aspects need to be taken into account as well. In terms of individuals that people might know or at least heard about, former Senator John Mccain served during that war. So he can be defined by being in that war versus Senator Blumenthal, I think he's out of the Northeast somewhere, served during the era, but he never served in the war. So you could have theoretically something that would have happened to both of them, and simply because of the prospect that they served during that era, the mindset for a lot of people is going to be it's automatically because of conflict, whether it was or not. They're trying to, goes back to what one of your former guests, Dr. Marshik, said with regards to things of confirmation bias. We kind of want to go to that lens because it makes sense to us. It's easier for us to go there, whether we should or not. It's easier for us to go to that route. So that's something that we kind of need to take a step back from when we're looking at this, if we're really trying to make progress. And I think there's no shortage of passion and emotion to do that. I just think that passion and that emotion has overridden the facts a little bit too much on this issue.
Right. So you're basically suggesting we look at this issue in a scientific way and start to look things into more finer scale.
To an extent, I'd say we need to kind of get out of that very focused picture that we have right now, because it's just part of a very larger tapestry, and we're not really looking at the larger tapestry to really understand that this is a very complex issue. It's not very simple. We shouldn't treat it as simple, but we keep going down that route of doing that because it makes
to
sense.
believe.
Yeah,
It's easy to
it's
believe,
the
yeah.
path of least resistance, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Interesting, because the first time I heard about you talk about this, especially for the peacetime statistics,
Yeah.
it's just like, wow.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
now you have the evidence, I believe it.
yeah. Well, I've had this conversation before I even had some of the evidence, because some of these things weren't making up, and I've had these conversations with people that have degrees upon degrees more education than I have, and they're not dumb people by any stretch of the means. But I would say something's not right here. We can't assume that this is just the one-way thing. And then when I finally get the evidence and show it to them, it's like like all of a sudden, it's not necessarily like an eye opener for them to go, "Oh, you are right." It's more along the lines of, "Well, I wonder how that happened. What's causing that?" It's like, I've been telling you, you got to get outside of that nice little the mindset. So
Yeah, quoting Marshik is actually the illusion of knowledge. You
Yeah.
think you know the causation, but actually no.
no,
It's not as you thought.
no.
Okay, so have you talked about your ideas or advocate your ideas to anyone, and are any facilities taking actions to investigate further? in this?
I've talked with different individuals along the way. There's still some of them are seeing this, but they're not necessarily sure how to do. And some of the people that I would talk to are wholly invested into the way things are currently operating. So I don't know that they're in the position where they would want to speak to me, because I'm kind of throwing a monkey wrench into the way they're operating, so to speak. Plus, it's kind of going against a brick wall in many respects for a lot of people. One of the people that I had conversations with on this a lot to try to get is my own father, who's been involved with medicine for well over 40 years. And we had this conversation that the era aspect that I brought up to you, when I finally showed him that, was like a lightning bolt to him in certain respects of, whoa, that's different. What are we supposed to do? He understands that not everybody should be put into the very confined picture, the box, so to speak. And there are several others that I've talked to, a couple of VA or former retired VA practitioners and some other individuals here and there. But as a whole, it's been slow going, and sometimes you just got to bring it out and present it as you can and get people to try and understand.
Even for people who are thinking about joining the army at a young age,
Yeah.
you should know this side. Even though there's no conflict, there's still a
No,
high possibility.
No, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that. The Army is an interesting one, because they've actually been able to do some good surveillance over the last 10 years. Part of it actually was as a consequence of a law, but people aren't paying attention to kind of the results with regards to the surveillance. They've not only been tracking suicide in terms of the actual losses, they've actually been tracking attempts. And if you start looking at some of the little things that come out of that, you see that there's stuff that's been around for us to look at, but nobody would think about it unless you're really interested in trying to understand this issue. One of the examples on that is the people that have been most, for lack of a better word, successful in taking their lives have been people that have been deployed. However, the majority of people trying to take their lives have not. Even some of the people that have been successful, I think it's a 60-40 split in terms of people, whether they've completed suicide or not, have deployed, versus the 60% that have not. So there's other aspects that are going on that nobody's looking at.
It's a bigger base number for people who
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
deploy, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but nobody wants to I think, touch that, because they're just focused on ending the acts themselves without trying to understand why they're occurring. So when you consider, especially as things get further and further along, where we're not nearly as involved as we used to be, say, 6-7 years ago in the Middle East, there's the amount of attempts is still growing. People talk about the amount of successes, but they're not looking at the amount of attempts. The last one that I saw had for the active duty military was 325 last year.
So how do they actually count that? Do they actually self-report? I had this offense. Or actually, they actually have a record.
There's,
You attempted and failed.
I would imagine there's a record partially because of the hospitals and because of treatment aspects for the people that did not did not succeed.
So it's not just a
So
thought.
no,
You
no,
actually implement it
no.
to
Yeah,
a certain
there's
level.
and it also kind of goes to things like looking at methods of trying to do this. Most people know that in America, the most successful tool, so to speak, again, for lack of a better term, tends to be firearms.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily, in terms of the active duty military side, the most utilized tool. It's obviously the most successful tool. It's not the most utilized. If you were to look at the most used tool, it would be drugs and alcohol. But nobody would think about that because they don't have the same success rate, so to speak. They have if you incorporate the completed suicides, again, for lack of a better term, into this, the ratio is about 2 or 3 to 1, firearm versus alcohol and drug use. If you remove the completed suicides, it jumps to like 10 to 1. But nobody would know that if you're not paying attention to these. So these little small details that open up the complexity of the picture for us to go, well, maybe we need to stop and take a look back and not focus so heavily on this very small particular aspect. Let's broaden it out. Let's take some time. But I don't know that anybody's wanting to do that at the present time.
So currently there's nothing, no actions taken to...
Right now, Senator Baldwin, actually, from Wisconsin, introduced or is a co-sponsor of a bill with regards to looking at, within the VA, suicides that have happened within the VA and whether or not medication or illicit drugs, depending on how you look at it, has an effect with regards to suicidality. If they were to look, say, at those DOD suicide event reports, they'd see that, yeah, it tends to be one of the more, it probably is one of the more prolific items used to try to take lives. It may not be the most successful, but there's a connection there somewhere. The question is what got them onto the drugs and alcohol, whether or not it was an attempted suicide, because there are people that go on that for things like self-medication or, things of that nature. So there is that, but it's just a general trying to find out what's going on. There's enough evidence to say that something's going on, but you need to look further into the details. And it's good that they're looking into the VA with regards to that, but I don't know how successful it's going to be in terms of coming up with viable long-term solution to stem this problem.
So for now, it's fair to say we are still at the early stage. We're not
Very
thinking about
much.
actions yet.
No,
We're trying to figure out the
no. And a lot of it is still based on explicit kind of mental health foci. Right now, the VA's official program is to go towards what's called evidence-based practices. The biggest one is a concept called CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a couple of different practices within that and disciplines within that they go to. The basics of which basically say within 12 sessions over a 3-month period, we will be able to take whatever it is, pretty much focused on post-traumatic stress, and bring that down in theory so that you are cured, and therefore the level of suicidality will drop as a consequence. Well, they've been pushing that for years, and it really hasn't done a whole lot in terms of the numbers. And I think it can work in certain conditions, but people aren't really willing to take the time to see which conditions it actually works in and which ones it doesn't, where we need to come up with some other alternative, like the traditional kind of long-term mental health.
So may I just interrupt here? Are you saying like it's not as effective because we didn't scale that thing big enough for everybody to have the treatment, or actually for the people who did the treatment, it didn't help?
It helps in certain cases, but if you're trying to cure and solve a problem, you have to be able to make sure that it works and it's actually making it so it's not negatively impacting the life long term.
So there is no lack of treatment, at least?
No,
okay.
No, but the way the treatment's being done is very left wanting. Plus, the way this thing is, it's a very structured, specific program. So there are very specific things you have to do each week that are required for this. But if something intervenes where it deviates and you have to deal with something else or you're not able to do an immediate, you have to start the program over.
Oh.
So it doesn't allow for flexibility from everything that I've heard or seen so far, which is kind of what you really need if you're really trying to solve this problem of bringing people down in an effective way where it can do that. But it's also, again, that presumed focus of there is a mental health aspect only. And that tends to be a dangerous proposition to look at as well, simply because you can't know that with any degree of certitude. A lot of people have, say, an acute episode of depression. They don't have a long-term diagnosis, but you have to be depressed in some manner to be at a point where you're even considering these things, whether it's a chronic ailment or not. What causes that depression is the more important thing to try and figure out, because that will help figure out coping mechanisms and things that will bring people off the ledge, rather than just trying to go, well, let's just process this idea that you may or may not have had.
That's a valid assumption, actually, because a lot of psychological problem is due to your physical problem.
Right.
Right. It's like your job, your
Yeah.
family, your relationships, and everything.
Yeah.
So just according to what you personally know, like,
Yeah.
can you give us a picture? Give us a picture, like what a veteran's life is like if you're in this kind of situation.
I can give you a personal example from my own life. That
If you
yeah, no, that's
Don't
not
mind.
that's not a problem. The episode, the only suicide attempt I had, one of my particular triggers is an irregular or inconsistent sleep cycle. And we were getting through and going into, I think, midterms for the spring semester, and for whatever reason, my sleep cycle was really, really bad. That's one of the things that allowed for my mindset to go to that place. Within the first year, it had nothing to do with stuff in times of military. It was just other things came into play. My other big trigger that's usually gone to elevate different ideation episodes, or what I refer to as a little bit more of an extreme planning episode, which is that most dangerous, from my perspective, the most dangerous period, because if a person gets entrenched in a planning episode, that they get really serious, once they make that decision, you will never, the average person, even people that are close to them, will never know.
it's just the detail then.
Yeah.
Starting
Yeah.
from there. Okay.
Yeah. It's the basically figuring out, putting
How to do it.
But my more serious planning episodes have been a consequence of interpersonal relationships. In this case, feelings that I wasn't trying to find for somebody that happened to come into place. Discomfort, it's that relationship aspect of things that I wasn't looking for, wasn't trying to find, came in and kind of overturned my life in some respects, as I'm trying to push it aside while going to school, while doing, 4 or 5 different other things to do this. And this was in the period when we were still coming out of that recession. So finances is always an issue, and all of these different just life experiences. And these are the everyday kind of experiences that people, there was an interesting book that came out some years ago by a guy that is out of California who had a kind of an emergency center that was geared towards doing suicide prevention, because California, especially, I guess, for a long time around the Golden Gate Bridge, was a hotbed for places for people to want to go. Yeah. And he puts an argument that the military for the longest time was focusing on these everyday kind of things and not taking post-traumatic stress into account. And he's right on that, but he overemphasized the post-traumatic stress and kind of went with everybody else and said, but these everyday factors are kind of, they're a pittance, they're kind of irrelevant to the overall thing. The thing is war and PTSD and stuff. So it's like he went the extreme opposite way, when in fact both of them are important. My twin brother, who has been a student on and off here, we've had conversations, because he was a Navy vet and he also had spent some time in the Gulf. His particular suicidal triggers are very much related to his service, whereas mine are not. And we both had experiences in a war zone. So it's kind of, you got to be able to take an individual as an individual when you're kind of looking at this problem.
So individuals have different experiences when
Yes.
they experience this, and they have different triggers.
Yep.
And usually they're actually based on their everyday life.
It can be. It depends on the individual. Some people, very much the incidents that they did in war are very much the triggers. But you have to be able to know that person to know that and understand where that fits into the larger context of their everyday lives. In my case, it's explicitly everyday triggers. It's not on anything with regards to that, except for maybe an environmental aspect. There's times of the year where I'm a little bit more susceptible that align with some things that happened when I was serving, but they're not the triggers. They just happen to make it periods where I know I'm more susceptible. They're not the triggers. They just happen to be recognized periods where I'm a little bit more reflective on things that happened in the past.
But if you think about that, it's almost impossible to prevent. So what, because there's not a unique or even several possible causes, right?
No.
So what would you think would have made a difference in your case? Like, for example, if you could just take a break with enough money to support yourself for 1 year after you go over the PTSD session and then start school, maybe better?
There's just a whole host of things. In my instance, it was good that it happened to an extent right around spring break. And this actually wasn't my worst case. My worst case was a very heavy planning episode that happened the following year, which my grades at that point really getting deleterious. If I'd have been smarter, I wouldn't have taken nearly as many credits right away, which was the first problem. I think I started over at the tech college with a 17 or 18 credit semester, and that was a little bit, and I kept something along those lines, about 15 for about 4 semesters in a row, finding out that probably wasn't the smartest idea, so I slowed down and did it that way. But sometimes those are hard lessons to learn. So long as you don't follow through to that point, you might be okay. But again, part of it is just knowing what the individual recognizing what they need and what they don't need. And sometimes other people need to tell them, and sometimes they'll know, but they need other people to recognize that so that they can be a support network.
Were you facing this alone?
Some of them, yes. Some of the more extreme elements, I have not really told too many people. There's a very close-knit group that's around me that are aware that I am susceptible. And in the more extreme episodes, they may get a call saying, hey, keep an eye on me. I'm going through a rough period. But if it's just a quick, just kind of a bad day, 5-minute come in and leaves, like a lot of people have a tendency to do, they just have a bad day and they said, screw it. You know what I mean? Apologize for the language, by the way.
Yeah.
But they'll have that mindset, and then it'll just dissipate because they'll go, well, that was stupid. Why was I even thinking that? Those kind of incidents I don't tell them about because it comes and it passes. The more serious ones I make sure that they're involved with, so that I'm not so much not alone, but as a precautionary measure in case things get worse.
So how in this situation, how you wish the people around you to react? Yeah,
it's more or less, hey, can you give me a call? A lot of times it's, can you give me a call in a couple of days just to check up on me, more or less. That way they know that there's a requirement to call you, and if I don't respond, then they know they need to respond in kind in some way.
Do you prefer to be around people?
Some of the military aspects, no, just because I'm not a big fan of crowds. But the people that and I'm also a very severe introvert. But I'm working on that to an extent, just to try to make myself a little bit more used to being out with crowds. The size is going to be the issue still. But the people that I know that are close to me, the ones that I know that I don't have to worry about them being there for me or not, they know who they are, and they're usually there in the event that I need them. Those are the bonds that are very positive in that regard.
I see. Okay, so we talk about your personal experiences on this, right?
Yeah.
And then I think that helped me to have a feeling about what kind of struggle you have.
Yeah.
Especially it's on a daily basis, and anything can trigger it, which is really...
Well, this is where I said I go back. Sometimes it's good to know what your triggers are. I know what mine are, and I happen to know when they're more likely to give me pause.
Did you self-reflect to find that? Like, this happened 4 or 5 times, so I become aware of that. I stay away from that.
Pretty much after the second or third time, it was one of those ones, certain things, you could see the patterns on the wall. The sleep one is very much one. If I get an irregular sleep cycle or if I'm in a weird one. There was a job I had here that when I within that first year, I had a part day, part evening. So it would be one of those ones where I would be on for 2 days during the day and then on for 3 days in the evening, so my sleep cycle was very inconsistent.
Yep.
So I had to be very cautious, and I knew that, and things of that nature. Or if I don't get a reasonable amount of sleep before I go in, I know that I got to be cognizant of that. Relationship-wise, has been somewhat of an easier thing for me in some respects and more difficult in others. It's just don't get in one.
Yeah.
But the problem in that one is the mind and the way things work, and in tandem with the heart, you can't guarantee that either. So it's watching for, okay, this person is interesting. Maybe there, and then I usually go, okay, stop right there. let's get away from that possibility, as much as it goes against kind of societal norms.
So as time goes by, do you feel like the situation is getting better, or actually periodically does it just come back?
For me, it's manageable. They don't happen nearly as regularly as they used to back probably about a decade ago, but they're still around, and I still keep a watch for them, just so that I'm prepared to adjust and be ready to put in whatever I need to mitigate the worst elements till those episodes pass. With regards to the problem writ large, it's not getting very much better, because as we've said a couple times, there's a pigeonhole idea of what this thing is supposed to be, and so when everything is kind of geared towards that, whether it's intended to or not, it keeps it where it is. This last year, they had the VA released its report, and it showed long-term trend from, I think it was about 2005 up to about 2017. And the long-term trend for veteran suicide is actually pretty flat. It's only grown about 6.5% over those 14 years, compared to the rest of the population, which is grown 43% as a whole over them.
That's
yeah.
surprising to know.
Well, part of veterans actually still make a disproportionate amount of the losses compared to the size of our general population. It's kind of like you hear with people that are in, like African Americans that are in prison. Compared to the size of the population, there's way too many of them in there, and we can always talk about that some other time, because it is an injustice. But veterans have always kind of been on that way with regards to suicide. Probably about 14, 15 years ago, we made up 1 out of every 4 or 1 every 5 suicides. Now we make up 1 out of every 7. It's not because veteran suicides have dropped. It's because the rest of the population has gone up. And part of that could probably be due to the issues of the recession, especially when everybody had those huge financial issues in 07, 08, 09. You know, that tends to affect everybody. Doesn't matter where you fit on the cycle. But we're still disproportionate. Theoretically, we should be, just because of the size of our population, we shouldn't be making 1 out of 7. We should be making 1 out of every 14. So we're still not in a good spot.
I see the situation. So we're in according to what I heard, I'm going to summarize, like, we're in this early stage of facing the problem. Maybe there's further investigation needed in a certain area which we haven't looked at yet before.
There's been ongoing stuff since at least 2008, which is really 2005 was when you started getting rumblings of that there was an issue. 2008 is where they started taking steps, but the steps they've done has been, and I think part of it was because we've been involved in a conflict, and it's suddenly now more aware for people to see that there's an issue to an extent. That's one of the reasons why it suddenly came up on people's radar, but it's been around a lot longer than that. Before they updated their method in determining the rate, the VA, the last one they had before they did that was 20 a day. The first report that they had back in 2012, which did 22 a day as of 2012, that big one that everybody kind of was paying attention, was like, holy cow, it went all the way back to 1999 when we weren't really involved in anything except for some peacekeeping missions. This is 2 years before 9/11, and it was 20 a day in 1999. So this has been a long-term issue for some years. We're just now becoming aware of it.
I see. So what do you think are some possible actions once we actually finish the investigations? Have you talking with people about ideas like how to make this better, how to help the people?
Part of it is making sure that the people that actually need the support actually get that support, whether it's mental health support or not. It's going to be hard to get that across to some people. Some people get it. Some of the people that I've talked to that are, one woman is a caregiver that I've talked to for a disabled Vietnam vet, and she's seen it, and she's wholeheartedly understanding on this one because the Vietnam veterans are kind of getting pushed aside again because of the post 9/11. I don't know that it's necessarily intentional, but it is what it is. She recognizes that fact, and she recognizes the distinction that needs to be made with regards to understanding the importance of rates, but also the percentage of proportionality of the losses. But that's been an ongoing slow basis. The first real big legislation that came through on this one, I believe it was 2009 or 2010, was what's referred to as the Clay Hunt Save Act. It was named after a soldier who had passed via suicide. And initially it comes across as geared towards suicide prevention among the veterans community writ large. But when you get into the details, you find out it's not so much that. Towards the end of the legislation, there's a provision in there that makes it so that there is an extension of mental health services, understandable because you want to make sure that everybody has those services available to them, but only to post 9/11 veterans. They're not the ones that need that extra service. It demonstrated kind of a disconnect and a misunderstanding. Granted, it was still early when these things were coming out to understand where and how big the impacts were. But even in the first VA report in 2012, they said about 65 or 68% of the people that were taking their lives were over the age of 50, and that's going all the way back to 1999, and it's continued to be that way. So you're talking about most of the people still are outside of the 18 to 34 post 9/11 contingents, but nobody's really talking about that. And until we start bringing that out and start recognizing that and start recognizing the other individuals that may be going through hard times, whether it's service connected or not, we're not going to make nearly as much traction. And I've pushed, not really pushed, but I've recommended this to some individuals, and some get it and some don't, because it's like I said, my father, he was a smart guy, and I kept telling him something's not quite right. We can't do PTSD as kind of the thing, and until I could show him that graph that said, by the way, 1/3 of the individuals that's taking their lives is of peacetime cohort, it didn't register until I had that kind of stuff there to really show people.
Yeah, it also has some implications, like basically this is just like but what happens in the army, basically, right? So that's also hard to take. No, it's that confirmation bias, though, too, because particularly since we've been dealing with it and recognizing it more while we're still in the midst of extended conflict, it's easy to kind of go that route. And we got to be able to not go the easy route and sometimes take a little bit step back. I think it's difficult to see actually such experiences actually haunt individuals for such a long time.
Yeah.
You mentioned actually a lot of suicide actually happens when people get older.
Yeah.
Compared to like normal population.
Yeah.
Right?
And there could be a whole host of reasons for that. There could be divorce issues, relationship issues. There could be financial issues. I would imagine a whole bunch of people had that in 2008 and 2009 when, say, a lot of the people that are on the upper end of that scale had probably been saving and doing all these other things, and everything just dropped out because of the recession and the way that happened. Well, now they're in a bad financial situation. If they were already having marital problems, per se, that could come on. If they're actually having issues where they're finally coming to terms where they want to get help for things that they may have dealt with in the military, whether they were combat related or not, on top of that, well, that just throws that into the whole wire. So it's recognizing that we can't put this down into a very nice, neat package. This thing is a lot more complex than people probably want to admit, but we have to admit that if we're going to actually make any progress in kind of dealing with it. So
it's a nice conversation. It's fascinating for me to see actually you connect your personal experiences.
Yeah.
And now it become part of your career.
Yeah.
And with your training in political science, you're trying to make the impact you can.
Yeah.
To just at least make people aware of this issue, and
yeah.
we will see how long it takes for us to actually take some actions on it.
Yeah, well, it's in a different way because there's a lot of people that are doing most of the articles, going back to the newspaper articles I told you with the presentation. Most of them, if you're looking at them, what they're trying to do is get people aware of this issue, and it's usually focusing on the statistic, and it's usually trying to get them interested in a fair, very interesting way, like walks, runs, push-up contests, these sort of things. And that's fine to an extent, but if we're not getting into the kind of the substance and trying to understand the complexity, you can't really take that very far. You make an awareness, but you're not really getting a contextualized awareness to solve the problem.
Are there many people like you pushing the same, delivering the same message nationwide?
There's some people that are starting. I just read an article over the weekend that was looking at more of a qualitative review of individuals who had served, and they were explaining how the general push is to put things in the context, one, of mental health, but also get them geared so that they can put them into the diagnosis and then go to the treatment plan that they've already designated as the cure. And the group of individuals in this case, one is I think a VA person out of Texas, and another one is a professor of psychiatry. I forget exactly where. They put this article out. It really just came out within the last week or two, and it was one of those ones is you can see some people are starting to realize we can't just hold to this very simplistic mindset. So I sent them a thank you message on that one for actually having the capacity to put that in the academic and the peer-reviewed literature. And they connected me onto a website that's actually taking a look at this from the more critical way of looking at it, kind of outside the mechanicalized push that healthcare is going in regards to this issue. So it's like, we need to look at this from ways other than the way we've been continually looking at it, because otherwise we're not going to really solve this problem.
If you think about it, actually, university is the right place to initiate a lot of studies.
You
have the authority, right?
You would think, but a lot of them are geared towards kind of, especially for this issue in particular, there's a tendency to kind of want to reinforce that this is a program that works and it should be able to be done, and solve these problems, and it doesn't necessarily work that easily or that smooth. A former retired VA official that I knew, we had a conversation on this one time. They decided in part to retire because they were being told they had to go along these particular practices, and they had a private practice before they entered public service for a long time. So they recognized that you can't have this very mechanized, very heavily structured, not allowed to have fluidity and adjustment, and recognized that was going to be a problem long term with trying to resolve this issue. So they retired. They told me that the shortest amount of time it took them to get it where a veteran that they had talked to was not severely impacted by, in their case, very complex post-traumatic stress, was the shortest amount of time, was 4 years. And we're talking probably something along the lines of, weekly sessions. So you're trying to condense what was over 200 sessions down into 12. It saves money for the government and saves money for the institution, perhaps. And where the issues aren't complex, it probably is a good tool. Most situations are not that simple, though. So,
and you need to integrate those kind of things with people's life too.
Yeah,
which is hard, right?
Yeah. And if you're operating off of the presumption that it's explicitly this, well, what's the point of integrating all those life aspects into it? That's where the mindset it can go, and it can get very dangerous. There are people that are starting to realize that, and they are doing it within the academic sphere and some of these things. But compared to the majority of the things that are out there, they're very much in the minority. And it's a slow start, unfortunately, to get people to realize we need to expand our understanding of this to the complexity of the way it is, rather than how we would like it to be.
Seems like you pick a long-term fight for yourself.
It is, but if we're going to make it, if we're going to solve this problem in real terms, it's going to be a long term. My dad and I, when we've had this conversation, he's like, how would you be able to measure that we're making progress? And my answer, and I've said this to a counselor who's out of Colorado, who we had a conversation with and did a podcast of his some months back, was long-term trends. You kind of have to look at long-term trends. Now, there's going to be the lag, but if you're doing the right things, it's kind of like people that are going through a diet. If you're going through and doing exercise, if you're doing things right, it's going to go slow, but it'll last longer and it'll be more effective. Versus like the people that go on to these things where they lose like 90 pounds in like 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden the next time anybody sees them, they're like not only gained the weight back, but they've gained excess on top. You got to be careful to not go on these very easy routes and try to do it short term. I think, what was it? One of the presidential candidates on the Democratic side said that they were planning on reducing veteran suicides by half in 4 years. That is a overly optimistic and a complete misread of the way the situation is. So
one person's lifespan is actually fairly long.
Yeah.
Right. You cannot simply even measure within 4 years.
Well, no, not even close. And I tend to put for the mental illness aspect of it, where people in the mental health aspect for it, I tend to look at it along the lines of something like MS or cancer or some of these things. Particularly, cancer is probably the best one. You can get cancer into remission, but there's always a risk that it can come back. So you need to be cognizant of that. Mental health, in many respects, is the same way. You can make it so that it's not effective, but you can't guarantee that it won't come back depending on certain circumstances later in life. So there's always you need to be very cognizant of that and watch that as you're going through these things. Not everybody seems to understand that for some reason.
But kind of overemphasize physical health compared to mental health from the beginning, right? So
to an extent, but it's easier to understand physical health than it is mental health. One person that I know has I take that back. Not always physical health, and I have a very good example on that one. A veteran I know who's married to a Gold Star sister that I am in contact with, because I'm also in that category of background, lost his leg in service. So he's got an amputee. He's got a mechanized leg. Every once in a while, he has to get re-verified with the VA that, yes, his leg has not grown back, even though this is a very straightforward, explicit, you can see it kind of a thing, versus a mental health aspect. Usually most people still will recognize the difference between a physical wound, though, and a mental health aspect, because usually the former are much more visible than the latter. Not always, but generally speaking.
Cool. I think we had some nice conversation here, and actually I think you're doing the right thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard, but hopefully you can make some progress someday. But what do you want to say to people who maybe see the same thing you see, and where are your next step, or what's your next action?
For those that see kind of the same things that I am, if you see it, please make sure people know. Make sure you
people around you.
Yeah. For next steps, I've written and published a self-published book. It's called Tunnel Vision, and it addresses a lot of the stuff that we've just discussed. My hope is to get that into some hands of people that might actually recognize they need to shift their viewpoint, and just try to get that information out there and have these kind of discussions wherever I can have them, to kind of get people to understand we need to make a shift. It's going to be a long-term thing, but sometimes the things that matter do take time. So
Yeah, anything worthwhile is.
yeah.
What about from a personal perspective, who has actually suffered from this kind of issue
Yeah.
before? What do you have to say to the people who are facing the issue on a daily basis?
Yeah, as hard as it's going to be to see some light, there is one. Try and look for that as hard as it's going to be. Recognize that not everybody else is going to see what you're seeing. Does not mean they don't support you. It just means they don't understand. Find something that will help you bring through any dark periods you have. For the longest time, that was my niece and my nephew, and to an extent it still is because they're still young. But I'm always looking for other things to help if I ever get into those low lows, for something that is a positive thing to look forward to. At the moment, it's trying to get this issue changed. So
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
And may God bless.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, same. Thank you for having me.
That was nice.